The attack stunned America. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, Japan bombed the American fleet based in Pearl Harbor in the Pacific Ocean. This surprise attack killed 2,000 Americans and completely changed the course of history. The United States went to war. The trap snapped shut on the 120,000 people of Japanese origin then living on the west coast of the USA. Since the end of the 19th century, many Japanese had left their homeland and settled in America. The law prevented them from taking American nationality, but their children born in the US were American citizens. For the FBI, they were all suspect. They were potential traitors, the enemy within. We're going to relive this period with Bill Manbo, an American citizen of Japanese origin, and his family, caught up in the turmoil of the war in the Pacific.
The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
It was Mary who heard the news on the radio. We didn't believe it at first. Japan had attacked the US. Japan, the land of our parents, of our ancestors, had attacked the United States, our country, Billy's country. Billy, our little boy, couldn't care less. He wasn't even 2 years old. Mary and I knew that our lives were going to be turned upside down. We tried to make sense of it. I mean, we were Americans. We'd grown up here, and we didn't even speak Japanese. We had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. Unfortunately, our faces looked like those of the enemy. On the morning of the 28th of April, 1942, I was determined to go to the garage just like any other day. I started work, and then I said to my guys, we'll finish this, and then we'll clear up. We're gonna clear up because I have to close the garage. We knew very well that we couldn't do anything else. Shigeteganai, our parents always said. There's nothing you can do about it. We had to go. No one knew where. Mary started to pack our suitcases. She shut the doors and the shutters. She sat outside the house. Billy just carried on playing. And we waited, ready.
In the spring of 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 that ordered the evacuation from the west coast of every person of Japanese origin. The most extravagant rumors were doing the rounds. The Japanese were accused of poisoning the water reservoirs or even of sending messages to Japanese forces to enable them to attack California. Every person of Japanese origin was required to hand in radios and cameras to the authorities. They were suspected of using them for spying. From March to June 1942, in neighborhood after neighborhood, the army carried out the evacuation. Bill, Mary, and young Billy, like tens of thousands of others, were forced to leave their home, taking with them just a suitcase. They were herded together on the Santa Anita racecourse near Los Angeles. For 6 months, they slept in stables that still stank of horses. Meanwhile, 10 camps were hastily built, scattered around the middle of the desert. In September, flanked by soldiers, they were put into trains taking them away from the west coast.
The journey was endless. We'd been traveling for 5 days. We crossed the Californian desert, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. We told Billy we were going on a big trip. The train stopped at Cody in Wyoming. We'd arrived at Heart Mountain, the camp we'd been sent to. Straight away, we felt the cold air, the wind from the desert, and the dust lashed our faces. We were allotted a small room in one of the huts. Around all of us was a desert, as far as the eye could see. We were in 28F7. The partitions didn't even go up as far as the ceiling. You could hear everything. They gave us army camp beds, blankets, a coal stove, one small light bulb for the ceiling. No water, nothing to cook with. The dust got in everywhere. This is where we were going to live. No one knew for how long. I'd managed to keep my camera. I had taken it and hidden it in my suitcase. As night was falling, I secretly took some photos.
By the autumn of 1942, the American West Coast had been completely emptied of all people who looked like the enemy. Shopkeepers had quickly sold off everything before leaving. A federal agency had been set up to implement this obligatory migration. From then on, all people of Japanese origin lived in one or other of the 10 relocation camps. By train and by bus, over 10,000 people arrived at the Heart Mountain camp. Displaced without ever having been tried. 2/3 of them were children and young adults with American nationality. The local population were anxious as they watched these new people arrive. The local newspaper in Cody, the nearest town, splashed on its front page, 10,000 is a lot of Japanese.
The guy in charge of the camp agreed to let us take some photos, but the rules were strict. No photos of the barbed wire or the soldiers who were guarding us. I told him it's for my son, Billy. I bought the camera when he was born. I want to keep some record of him when he was small. I would never have imagined that I'd take photos of him in a camp. Because it was really a camp we were in. Meals, laundry, washing ourselves, everything was done in shared rooms. We spent our time waiting and standing in line. Mary and her younger sister finally let me take photos of them. Mary put on her favorite dress, the blue one. She was worried. The FBI had arrested her father, Junzo, a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. We knew he'd been put in jail. He wrote to tell us there was nothing to worry about, but she didn't believe him. The FBI arrested all those like him who had a role in the community. He was a member of an association that gave Japanese lessons. That meant he was suspect. Billy made friends straight away. His pal, Bobby, always had a scarf in the American colors around his neck. This was their country. They were born here. Nothing here surprised the kids or frightened them. The camp was like a vast playground. Just before we left, Mary bought Billy a little American Army outfit. He never took it off. I built him a little plane with what I could find here. All he wanted to do was make it fly.
It seemed that nothing could stop the Japanese forces. The war was raging in the Pacific. Hostility towards Japanese continued to grow in America. In the camps, people were getting organized. The internees took charge of a large part of the organizing. Everything had to be done. Preparing and distributing meals, caring for those who fell ill, building schools. All these things were carried out in the utmost calm, and while some were resigned, many were determined to show their loyalty to America.
That first winter was harsh. The temperature dropped suddenly. Everything froze. One night it was -30. In the huts, the freezing air and the wind blew through the partitions. We tried to forget the barbed wire and the guards who had orders to shoot if we went near the gates. I managed to photograph one of the camp watchtowers one morning. I don't think anyone saw me. I started to work as a mechanic at the warehouse. Time passes more quickly now, and I'm going to earn a few dollars. Of course, nothing like I used to earn before the war. I think about my tools that I left behind. There's no way of knowing how long we'll be here. When the war's over, maybe we can go home. Mary couldn't reconcile herself to being behind barbed wire. Just a few months ago, she was designing costumes for the theater mart. The show was a triumph. One night, she even saw Mary Pickford in the audience. It's exciting to rub shoulders with the stars. To begin with, there was nothing she wanted to do. And then she took up sewing again for her friend and her sister because she felt relieved. Her family was all together again. Her father, Junzo, was out of prison and he'd joined us. To celebrate Junzo's return, we took a photo of us, the men of the family. I wore my favorite Hawaiian shirt. Junzo barely mentioned the months he'd spent locked away. I think that for him, the idea that someone could think of him as a traitor was worse than having to leave everything behind. And then he started worrying about the little farm he'd left, his fields of rhubarb in California, everything he had built. The neighbor promised to look after it, but how could you trust him now? He got to work straight away. You need a lot of people to grow crops, and yet it's difficult to imagine that anything could grow in this desert. Every Sunday, my whole family went to Mass. My parents converted 40 years before when they arrived in America. One Sunday afternoon, a sumo wrestling tournament was organized. A lot of men came. We had a good time. The old-timers said, "Just wait and see. It'll bring us luck for the harvest." It was quite new to me. I grew up playing baseball and basketball. My hobby is automobiles. Me and my friend Frank, who worked in the garage, built these racing cars. When I work on my model cars, I forget everything else. This car was for Billy, so he could roll it in the dust. That's what I like, racing cars and photography. In the camp, with other photo enthusiasts, we formed a club. I built a tripod for my camera out of bits of wood I had salvaged. I sent the films to Los Angeles to the same shop I always went to, but I created a new identity for myself with a French name, Bill Manbo. It had a good ring to it. Neither American nor Japanese. I'd solved the problem. I was French.
The Japanese army suffered its first defeat at the Battle of Midway. This marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The Japanese were no longer invincible. In 1943, Japan was still at the head of an empire, but she had suffered heavy losses.
Summer arrived at last. We'd been shut in there for nearly a year. We celebrated the 4th of July, Independence Day. When the camp's Boy Scouts and majorettes started to march past, we all came out of our huts. Just like every year, we didn't want to miss that. But there, smack in the middle of the desert, behind barbed wire, we couldn't really be happy. What sort of country was this? Our country that we were celebrating, and that held us in prison. I thought of my friend Utaro. We grew up in the same neighborhood. He joined the army right after Pearl Harbor. He wanted to defend his country, to show that we're not traitors. He wrote us he couldn't wait to leave for Europe. But up to then, as he was of Japanese origin, he wasn't allowed to fight, not allowed to carry a weapon. War was on everyone's mind. But we didn't think about it. We just wanted it to be over, that's all. Prisoners in this vast desert, we waited. In the summer, we were stifled, and the days were long. Sometimes they would show us a film in one of the huts. And that year, they allowed us to celebrate the midsummer feast of the Buddhist calendar, Bonodori. The whole camp was there. It's a feast to honor the spirits of our forefathers. Some of the costumes were quite unexpected. The young women and girls of the camp danced for a long time in their yukatas, their brightly colored kimonos. It is one of the oldest Japanese traditions. It was strange to feel its beauty, lost somewhere in the vastness of the desert, under the eyes of the soldiers watching us. Because no one there could forget the barbed wire, and the mountain seemed to be standing guard. One day, we went to take a closer look at the wire that kept us in. Billy and Mary were there with me. I wanted to take a photo of Billy so that he wouldn't forget where he spent the first 5 years of his life.
Since the start of the war, young Japanese Americans, even though they were US citizens, were nevertheless considered as enemy aliens, suspect and unsuitable for combat. But in 1943, the tone changed. The army wanted to mobilize them to go and fight on the battlefields of Europe. But first of all, the authorities had to be convinced of their loyalty. Every person of Japanese origin had to fill in a questionnaire. This loyalty questionnaire galvanized the anger of the interned people. One question required them to choose to swear allegiance to the USA or to the Emperor of Japan.
It was all we could talk about in the camp, the loyalty questionnaire. The authorities wanted to know if we were prepared to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. Yes, of course, it's our country. But I added, on one condition, getting our rights back. I wanted to express my opinion. I was an American citizen, wasn't I? But apparently, they had a problem with our answers. Mary and I were called in for questioning, separately. They asked Mary if she'd choose American citizenship or Japanese. The one I was born with, American, obviously, she told them. I don't know Japan. I was born here and I've always lived here in America. I have no reason to go over there. We convinced them. But some of our neighbors were found disloyal and were taken off to the high-security camp of Tule Lake in Northern California. Just because they had asked for the camps to be closed down. We went to say goodbye to them. We all gathered outside the school. There were lots of us. The atmosphere was very tense. Some of us were fighting to get our American citizens' rights back. Others were fighting for America in Europe. I was thinking of my friend Yutaro. All we knew was that he had gone, first to North Africa and then to Italy. He didn't write much anymore.
25,000 young Japanese Americans joined up. A regiment was created, the 442nd, made up entirely of Americans of Japanese origin. Their motto was, "Go for broke." The regiment fought all through the Italian campaign. Naples, Cassino, Pisa. In the autumn of 1944, they were sent to eastern France. The German army had been dug in for weeks around the town of Poirier in the Vosges. The men of the 442nd liberated the town of Poirier on the 19th and 20th of October 1944. They then received the order to relieve a Texan battalion surrounded by the Germans. After 5 days of fierce fighting in the forest of Bifontaine, they broke through to the Texan soldiers, but the regiment had suffered very heavy losses.
Butaro was killed. In France, in the Vosges Mountains, according to the paper. He was 26. He was buried in a town called Épinal, in that country I dreamed of. He was fighting for his country, the USA. He was proud of it. He died to keep the world free. And we were still there in the camp. It had been 3 years. I knew every nook and cranny in that camp. I couldn't even bring myself to photograph it anymore. I'd had enough of waiting for the war to end. We hadn't told Billy yet that I was going to leave. And I was going to do it alone and leave Billy and Mary behind. I asked for permission to leave Heart Mountain. For a few weeks, they'd been allowing people to leave if they wanted to look for work. But it wasn't that easy. Where could we go? Where could we look? What sort of reception would we get? We couldn't go back home to Los Angeles. We were still banned from the West Coast. I decided to go to Cleveland. Mary and Billy would stay put until I found work. I promised Billy that we would all be together again soon.
Germany capitulated in May 1945, but Japan refused to surrender. The United States decided to use atomic weapons, and at the beginning of the month of August, dropped atomic bombs on the towns of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Shortly afterwards, Japan surrendered unconditionally. Sirens sounded in Heart Mountain Camp. The war was over. The 442nd, the regiment composed entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, was the most decorated in the American Army. But it was also the one that suffered the greatest human losses. The Heart Mountain Camp closed officially on the 10th of November 1945. Every person interned in Heart Mountain was given $25 and a train ticket to the destination of his choice.
We were back to the bright lights of town. We'd finally got back home. A year after the end of the war, I reopened the garage. My tools were still there where I'd put them. And little by little, the customers came back. But for many of those who'd been with us at Heart Mountain, there was nothing left. Junzo and his wife would never return to their little house. The rhubarb fields had been plundered. They had to start all over again, from the beginning. And then, life picked up where it had left off. I put the photos into the boxes. I put away my camera. Mary and I wanted to move on.
Thanks to the exploits of the 442nd, America began to take a different view of citizens of Japanese origin. In 1988, Congress presented an official apology for the camps. Billy graduated in the same school as his father. He went to work for Boeing, developing security systems. Bill never took any more photos after he came back from the camps, and all his photos stayed in boxes. Billy grew up without hearing any mention of Heart Mountain. He has no memory of it. When his parents died, he gave all his father's photos to the little museum that preserves the memory of the camp.